We're going to get started. My name is Eugene Rule. I'm one of the group of volunteers that runs the program, and my job is to do the mailings and make the coffee. And I no longer have to make the coffee, but I have mine, so I hope everybody has theirs. Okay, I wanted to say a few words about the library and the Institute to start with. And our library was named in memory of two remarkable individuals, Carl Niebel and Roscoe Proctor, whose book collections form the core of what became the Niebel-Proctor Marxist Library for Social Research. Carl Niebel was a noted Marxist economist and scholar who came to the United States in 1934 after escaping from Nazi Germany. He served in the New Deal and US Navy in World War II and survived the anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy era while teaching at Temple University and several other universities before becoming a full professor at San Jose State University in the early 1970s. When Niebel passed away in 1985, he asked that his extensive library of books, pamphlets, and papers be made available to the public, and that his collection be named for his wife, Elizabeth Hale Niebel, who was a leader in public housing during the New Deal. Roscoe Proctor was born in Texas and moved to California in the 1940s. He had a long career as a farm laborer, longshoreman with the ILWU, and community organizer, mentoring Black youth in Oakland and South Berkeley. Proctor was a member of the Communist Party USA's political committee and served as secretary of its trade union department. The collections were moved into Berkeley's historic Finn Hall in 1987, and then were moved to our current home at 6501 Telegraph Avenue in Oakland. Unfortunately, we can no longer accept book donations, and we can no longer occupy our physical library, but we are occupying the physical Zoom virtual library. Since our founding, the library has served as a research center and a community center, providing affordable meeting space for diverse community groups and continuing Roscoe's work with Black youth in Oakland. About this same time, the Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebel-Proctor Marxist Library was formed to further the library's goal of preserving our written heritage as well as supporting emerging struggles for racial and gender equality and for socialism. The members of ICSS are active in different aspects of people's struggles in the Bay Area and globally. Some of us are affiliated with specific political parties and tendencies, others are not. We respect one another, but do not necessarily agree on all issues. Accordingly, the opinions expressed in our lectures, workshops, and publications are those of the speakers only and do not represent a group consensus on the issues discussed. We are united, however, in our respect for the work of Karl Marx and our belief that his work will remain as important for the class struggles of the future as they have been for the past. And as a group, we continue to draw inspiration from the work of Karl Marx, including his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And our speaker today is Raj Sahai, who very much exemplifies this stress that we have on changing the world. He's active in various organizations in his native India, as well as being very active here in the Bay Area. But I will turn it over to Alan, who will introduce the program and Raj. So over to you, Alan. And muting myself.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Everybody hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes.
We're pleased this morning on the almost to the day, the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in Japan, to have Raj Sahai speak. Raj is a longtime member of ICSS, a retired civil engineer who wrote an article on the 50th anniversary of the bombing. Yesterday was the 75th, Friday I think was 75th anniversary. And he will be speaking for about 1 hour on the bombing, followed by a question and answer discussion until about 12:30. So why don't you go ahead and start, Raj, and we'll take a break in the middle.
Thank you, Alan.
For the Q&A.
Good morning to everybody.
Raj, before you start, let me just point
Okay.
of order for the whole session is that because there are some background noises and things, so we are muting everybody. And sometimes it happens that people accidentally unmute themselves and their conversations come up and everything. So I'm going to mute everybody and not allow them to unmute themselves during the presentation. And then we'll change it when we come to Q&A. Just wanted to put that out there. Thanks so much.
And also that the program is being recorded.
Yes.
And later will be up on YouTube on ICSS Marxist channel. Okay, thank you, Alan, and thank you, Mehmet. Without your help, I couldn't be doing, and Jean, most of all, without whose help I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. And Sharat, as you see the image here, Sharat, Lin, and I were the founder members of a small group of South Asians, and we had a Bangladeshi with us, no Pakistani. And our goal was to try to fight the emergence of right-wing ideologies in the immigrant Indian community. And we fought it through fighting, writing letters in the local Indian publications, as well as our own publication. Image of one is in front of you. We were active between 1980s, late 80s, when right-wing Hindutva began its ascent in India, and until past mid-90s, when some members moved away, some died, and the organization fell apart. But for about 10 years, this was published, and we sent it around to libraries around the country. And they showed interest, and they kept it. And actually, when we stopped, they asked, why have you stopped? We haven't received it and all that. But anyway, to our today's talk, and this article I wrote 25 years ago, as Alan pointed out, was the lead article, and this was on Hiroshima 50 years after the human catastrophe. Today, it happens is the 75th anniversary of Nagasaki bombing. And 3 days before today, so that will be Wednesday, the 6th of August, was the bombing of Hiroshima. And as you know, recently, last week, also a explosion occurred in Beirut, where 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, which is used in fertilizer making and for explosion in mines, happened apparently accidentally. So far, that's what it's thought, and was very destructive, with casualties in hundreds, if not over 1,000. And because the bodies are still being pulled out from the rubble. But it does give, I mean, most people have seen these images either on television or internet, and that picture actually is relevant because it gives us a sense about what a mass terror this kind of bombing produces. And just for the scale of thing, this explosion was an equivalent of 1,100 tons of TNT. The Oklahoma City bombing, which brought down the federal building, had only 2 tons equivalent of TNT. So this is, as you can see, is over 1,000 times larger explosion. But when you compare it to the explosion in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were many times bigger than this. Hiroshima was almost 15 times as big, and Nagasaki almost 20 times as large. But there is something deeply troubling about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, aside from the destruction it caused, to which I will return. But what I wanted to do is to let us observe a minute of silence in the memory of and in respect for the victims of all these 3 events, one very recent, hopefully accidental, and the other 2, Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
A song which comes from Japan. They say that hardly anybody up there has not heard it at some time. Furusato no machi yakare, miyori no hone, umese yakatsuchi ni. 今は白い花咲く許すま次元爆を見たび許すま次元爆を我らの町に In the place where our old home village was destroyed, we buried the charred bones of our relatives. Oh, we must never allow, we must absolutely forbid another atom bomb to fall. Deadly rain gathers poison from the sky, and the fish carry death in the depths of the sea. Fishing boats are idle, their owners are blind. Deadly harvest of 2 atom bombs. Then landsmen and seamen, you must watch and take care that the 3rd atom bomb never falls. Furusato no machi yakare, miyori no hone, umese yakatsuchi ni. Ima wa shiroi hana saku, yurusu majigen baku o, mitabi yurusu majigen baku o, warera no machi ni.
Okay, so resuming the talk. Now, in Hiroshima, and what I like to do is to put up the bullet points at this point for you to see. So I have gone through introduction. I will go through these bullet points. Hiroshima atomic bombing, and civilians continue to die. And so Hiroshima had a population of 350,000. The US dropped its first atomic bomb, which had a uranium core, and was named Little Boy. It killed 70,000 almost immediately. Another 60,000 died by November of the same year, 1945, from injuries, but primarily from radiation injuries. By 1950, primarily by radiation, another 70,000 had died. So out of 350,000 population of Hiroshima before the bombing, 200,000 died by 1950. And majority of them due to radiation, not the atomic impact of the atomic blast, not by the bomb blast, but by that. So that constitutes about 57% of the population of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was largely, and Hiroshima was largely a civilian target. It was a staging ground for Japanese troops, and about 43,000 or so.
Raj, are you advancing slides at this point or no?
No, I'm just going to talk
okay.
here
Sorry.
on.
Okay.
Yeah, there will be no slides because there are members here who are on telephone.
Oh.
So I decided not to do other than one or two images. One of them is bullet points in front of you.
We don't see the bullet points.
You don't see it?
No.
Why is that?
You need to check the screen, which one you want to share.
Sorry, I apologize. Yeah, I have to change the screen. Okay, can you see it now? Oh, no, I have not yet.
No, it's a different window, Raj. You have to.
Okay, now you can see
Yes.
it, right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. About 43,000 Japanese troops were present because Hiroshima was a staging ground before they were deployed. But that was not the reason for the target, okay? The atom bomb killed mostly the civilians, men, women, children, and of course animals, birds, vegetation. Japanese army also lost some men, but they were less than 3,300 of soldiers in Hiroshima that day. That means may more have died, let's say twice that many died, including radiation, because they will also have the same ratio, maybe 3 times as many, maybe 20,000. But that was not the reason for choosing the target. Now, Nagasaki bombing, and I'm on to the third point. August 9, which is the anniversary today, 75 years later, population was 250,000. So this was the second atomic bomb with plutonium core. And this type of bomb was not tested before. The Hiroshima bomb was fission bomb. It was tested. It was a uranium core bomb. And it was tested before, but not this one. So this was truly an experiment. And it was named Fat Man. Now, it was much lighter, smaller, more compact, and it killed thousands, tens of thousands perhaps, but by the impact and heat, but by end of the year was 74,000 dead and 140,000 by 1950. So essentially, the total killing amounted to roughly 2.5 to 3 times than what bomb blast and heat from it killed. So that's the scale, 2.5 to 3 times. Again, it was not a military target, but this was a second target. It was not the first target. The first target was Kakura, which was a munitions plant location. It was a military target. Weather was not conducive to dropping the bomb. And so the pilot was given the alternate, and the alternate was a civilian target, that of Nagasaki. So these two acts show you the scale of what happened, and its major effect was radiation killing, okay? And radiation killing is very painful, as you know. It is not an ordinary kind of, if you die in a sudden bomb blast, yes, probably suffer pain, but it's very short-lived and you die. But radiation thing is an extended pain. It's like a torture. So barbaric acts, this is what I'm at. Atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were truly barbaric acts, measured by any civilizational norm. Now, Admiral Leahy, who was the Joint Chief of Staff, so he was above both General Marshall, who was the Army Chief, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the Allied Supreme Commander of the war, and a friend of Truman. Both men were friends. All three were not adverse to Truman. They were all close to him. So Admiral Leahy described these bombings this way, and I'm quoting it. It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. End of quote. President Eisenhower, now he became president after the war, you know, and after his presidency ended, and it was at the height of the Cold War, and after leaving the office, he said the following, recalling his reply to Secretary of War Stimson when the latter told him in late July 1945, this is at Potsdam conference in Crimea, of the decision to use the atomic bomb. This is what Eisenhower told the Secretary of War, quote, Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary measure to save American lives, end of quote. Now, the fact is that the bulk of the Japanese army was in China at that time, cut off from supplies, as the US Navy had by then almost completely dominated the seas, okay? Little doubt that Japan could not hold off when the Soviets entered the war. And it had to face both Chinese forces and Russian forces. So there was no question that that would have ended the war because there was no way they could have resisted it. The Potsdam Conference was delayed. You know, the Potsdam Conference was from July, I think, 17 to August 2nd. So that's 4 days before the first bomb was dropped. So the Potsdam Conference was delayed to late July so that Truman had his powerful weapon to back his negotiating position with Stalin. They're waiting for the tests and confirmation that they will be ready with these two bombs. So the decision to use it was political, not military. And this was argued by Gar Alperovitch, the historian, who, as his PhD thesis in 1965, published this book called Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam. And then again, he wrote another book in 1995, and that's titled the decision to use the atomic bomb, something like that. I have an exact definition somewhere in my writing here, but anyway. So he wrote that, he argued that this was German, you know, it's clear that this was not, there was a political decision related to Soviet Union, American power and Soviet power, the diplomacy of coercion, okay. Now, it's true the bombing of civilian targets by now well established. German bombing of British cities, Allied bombing of industrial workers housing in Germany. You know, the British bombers struck the German industrial workers who work in war industry. They attacked, they bombed the housing. The circle bombing of Dresden, you know, which was done from exterior going into the interior. So basically burning the civilians to death. And of course, the Tokyo and other Japanese cities bombing that actually destroyed somewhere between 25 to 50% of the urban centers of Japan before these two bombings. In fact, one of the reasons selection of these two cities was that they were not bombed before. They were, you know, they were big enough cities that were not bombed before. So they wanted to see the effect of it. So what is so different about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? It is the radiation poisoning. So as I pointed out, you know, that's so, and then the radiation is not something that just kills you. It, even if it doesn't kill you, it affects the future generations, as you know. A scientist now, did the Americans know? Yes, they knew about the radiation poisoning. A scientist at the Los Alamos lab, which built these bombs, had died of radiation poisoning when he was accidentally exposed to it. So they knew that this was deadly. So this aspect of bomb and scale of killing by a single bomb is why it is truly barbaric. And here I may be being a little unfair to the barbarians. I don't think they were as bad as this. So now I come to the next point, US public support. And this is really the thing that brought me into writing that article, okay? I came to this country in 1966 as a student, graduate student, University of Illinois, to do my master's degree in structural engineering. But soon after that, I started working in Chicago, 67 onwards, because I needed to earn the money and send money home. Then I came across, I met people, civilian life friends, American friends were formed, the construction workers, fellow engineers. And it was nagging to me since I was about 10 or 12 when I first became aware of this weapon, So I was born the same year this bombing occurred, but I was born earlier in the year 1945. So I became aware of it sometimes in mid-50s. And it seemed to me rather amazing that I had a very good impression because our house, we used to get Reader's Digest, my father used to get. And I liked that, lots of little quips there, quotes there, short stories and condensed books and all that. And I actually thought American life was a wonderful life, I like the modernity and so forth. Then I went to IIT Kanpur, which was American-funded institute, and there were American professors from many universities, including Michigan and Princeton and MIT and so forth. I learned actually my computers from two professors, one from MIT, who was one of the original person who put together the computers, and the second was from Princeton, also involved in the same. In fact, the Princeton professor later on told me at a Christmas cake sharing that he did with me, a friend of mine, that he worked on the Manhattan Project. So anyway, I was struck by the responses I got in Chicago from all these various sections. Everybody said, no. To me, it was a horrible thing coming from India. I was not exposed to all that Americans were exposed to regarding the bomb. And of course, I was not involved in the war. India was sort of marginally involved. Indian forces were there with the British. And the Japanese did actually help the liberation forces of Subhash Chandra Bose. But anyway, I was not, I never viewed anything positive about these bombings. And I always thought, don't the Americans think there is some comparison between this and what the Nazis did with the Jews and others, the terrible killing they did? Of course, there is difference, but the scale and this unjustified. But I was surprised. Almost everybody, I met nobody who did not say this was a good thing. They said, well, it was necessary, it ended the war, shortened the war, saved 500,000 American lives or 1 million American lives. And then they also said, also Japanese lives. To me, that stuck with me. And that's when in 50th anniversary, researched into what are the Americans thinking about it now? So what happened was that the point was the unconditional surrender. It was explained to American public that Japan was not willing for an unconditional surrender, and invasion would have cost a lot of lives, which was, by the way, planned of one Kyushu island in November, and then the mainland later on in April of 46. That was the plan. So So I studied for that and wrote this article. But at the same time, I also read the book by Professor Ronald Takaki in Berkeley, who wrote the book called Strangers from a Different Shore, whom I had met in connection with something else. So I sent him this article and he called back very enthusiastically. He said, you know, and then he met me later and said, Raj, I'm amazed at your how intense your feelings are about this. You know, you were in India, you were raised in India. Why are you so intense about this? And I said, it's a matter of justice for me. This seems barbaric to me. Anyway, so that's the history of why I wrote that article. Now, Alperovitz argued in his 1965 book, studying, atomic diplomacy. And basically the idea was that the American president wanted to restrict and manage the power of Soviet Union because they felt that Stalin, by winning the war, USSR had now ambitions in Europe, and certainly if they bombed, Japan, then the Soviet forces will not be needed. But to American public, it was said, well, they were not agreeing to surrender. The Japanese were fought to death, and they never surrender, and it would be very expensive. But that's not quite true, because the emperor had already decided well before decision to bomb them, well, or rather before it was bombed, but a couple months, 2-3 months before, the Japanese knew that they will not win, that they were defeated. I mean, they could not supply their troops in bulk of whom were in China and Korea, and they couldn't bring those forces back because the American Navy completely dominated. So, so the idea that unconditional surrender, the only thing the Japanese wanted was that they do not hang their emperor. They remove and hang him. Because for Japanese, the emperor Hirohito was a descendant of sun god. This is in their folklore, and it was their, this is how they ruled. So Japanese could not accept it. He was almost a deity to them. But then there is the counterpoint was that the Americans knew this, by the way. This is Alperovitz's second book reveals, which he studied in 1995. And why Alperovitz did 1995 book was, he was like me, troubled by the thing is, why do Americans continue to believe the original explanation when Eisenhower, upon leaving the office, had said, this was not the reason why we bombed, and this was a terrible thing to have been done. Now, why Eisenhower is saying that? Of course, after all, Eisenhower was the one who was planning to bomb the Soviet Union with several hundred bombs, nuclear bombs, simultaneously. A study which was conducted in the State Department by the person who later on wrote Pentagon Papers. And he found that if that was actually carried out, not only the Soviets will die, but a great number of Americans will die from that nuclear winter. So, and all of a sudden, Eisenhower was now realizing the danger. I don't know if he cared about the Russian lives, but he was realizing the danger it posed to American power and American, capitalism. So that's why he spoke, I think. And anyway, I want to go a little bit about what was the question about Germany. Had if the bomb was ready, would it have been used in Germany? And Germany had surrendered on 7th of May, 1945, before the atomic bomb was even tested. which was on July 16. The first atomic bomb test was conducted on July 16. There is little reason to doubt, in my opinion, that of also of these two writers, that if had the bomb been ready before the surrender of Germany, the US would have used it. And they would have used it for the same reason used in Japan. That is to control Soviet power, okay? To put them on notice that this will be used against them and to intimidate them. So now what about the relationship of USSR, US and Japan? US and USSR, as you know, were allies in World War II. In fact, Stalin was implored by President Roosevelt to enter the war against Japan at the Yalta. Yalta is in Crimea, not Potsdam. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Yalta is in Crimea. So, in that conference was held in February of 1945, early February. And Stalin in return promised Roosevelt that in 3 months' time, Soviet forces will join the war against Japan. Now, USSR was not at war with Japan. It had a neutrality pact with Japan, signed in April 1941. In fact, splitting Japan and Germany and Italy, who had the anti-Comintern pact, was a major diplomatic victory for the USSR, which avoided a two-front war for the USSR, which, if it had happened, may have overwhelmed the USSR because they were already stretched in one, war in the West, overstretched right there, and they managed to beat Germany, but with tremendous losses. So you can imagine what would have happened. So USSR, so it's safe that it was a diplomatic victory, and Japan, for its reasons, didn't want to be at war with Russia because they had other fish to fry, okay? So the USSR dissolved, but they were not friends. The USSR dissolved the neutrality pact with Japan on April 5, 1945. That was a signal, and Japanese were reading it, that, my God, this is the end. So that is why the explanation that it was necessary to bomb Hiroshima nuclear bombs of these two cities in order to induce surrender of Japan and save American lives is absolutely false. This was for public consumption. It was not a fact. So Truman became president. Roosevelt died on April 12th. Truman became president, and he had to continue Roosevelt's policies, which is what any vice president will do before he gets established. And USSR declared war on exactly on the date Stalin had promised, on August 8, 1945. This is 2 days after Hiroshima bombing. And so as he had promised to Roosevelt at Yalta. Okay, so now I'll go a little bit about the Manhattan Project itself that made the bomb, okay? It was initiated at the instigation of East European physicists, particularly two who had escaped fascism. Among them were Albert Einstein of Germany and Leo Szilard of Hungary. Both of them were instrumental in this, who informed Roosevelt administration on August 2nd, 1939, that Germany was likely to develop the atomic bomb. Roosevelt then initiated what came to be known as the Manhattan Project. So it was started in 1939. Now, what about the Germans? Germans were the most advanced in nuclear research in 1930s, and then this is thanks to the German philosophy, the materialist philosophy developed Hegel, Kant, Hegel, Feuerbach, and Marx. These are developers of materialist philosophy in the modern times. And Germany, of of course, was a benefited from all that, particularly before Marx, all others, but also Marx, okay? So they were the most advanced, their educational system, Berlin University. And so they could have developed, this weapon. So what happened? But, Hitler was told by his scientists, Heisenberg was actually a supporter of German, I wouldn't say German Nazism, he was supporter of German nationalism, and which meant supporter of Hitler in a sense. So these scientists would have made the bomb for him. They actually told Hitler was told by his scientists, German scientists, that it can be made, this nuclear power, and it can maybe made a bomb, but it'll take more than 4 years to develop. Now, Hitler believed he would win the war in much shorter time. And in any case, I'm not sure that he fully understood it, and he was impatient too. So the project was shelved in Germany, but it got started in the US. How are we doing on time? Okay, I've got about 20, I may need more than 20 minutes, but I'll try to do it 20 minutes. Okay, so now I'll go to the next point, which is the dilemma of the atomic scientists, okay? J. Robert Oppenheimer led the team of scientists and engineers that developed the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think most people here know. All three leading physicists, Einstein, Szilard, and Oppenheimer, and there's more, but these three had moral trepidation all along. They understood what they had some sense about this power, this enormous power concentrated in a bomb. It's both positive and negative consequences. They could feel it, right? Now, in terms of defeating Hitler's Nazis, that was a positive thing if it did, particularly if Hitler developed it. But they still had this moral trepidations. And so at that time, to keep them in the loop, they were working on it, but they had these moral things, moral doubts. And Truman had an advisor called the Interim Committee, which was about the development of nuclear policy and so forth. Policies related to everything related to the atomic bomb, not just the technical side. Technical side was the scientists. It's the political side and organizational implementation, all other things, policy side rather, and politics, So this guy Burns, later was James F. Burns, who was later from South Carolina, later to become Secretary of State under Truman. He came and explained to the scientists, and this is a quotation, "Our possessing and demonstrating the bomb would make Russia more manageable in Europe," end of quote. This is quoted from Alperovitz's book, The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. That's his 1995 book, the same year. And I had read that book when I wrote my paper. USSR, now next point, the USSR. What about the USSR atomic bomb? J. Oppenheimer and Szilard did not believe the atomic bomb could be kept secret for long. They were right. Soviets, thanks to their excellent spice network that extended into the Los Alamos laboratory itself, where these first two bombs were produced, was learning what was going on. Maybe not at the very beginning, but they were catching up on it. They had to. It was a matter of life and death for them. It was a socialism or capitalism. They knew the history. Americans had actually occupied a part of Soviet Union right after the revolution, in the north, along with other countries, England and all that. So they wanted to kill the baby, socialist baby. Stalin was no fool, and the Soviets were no fool. They understood. They were allies, but each side understood the other. So it was a matter of life and death. By 1943, USSR had started work on its own equivalent of a Manhattan Project. And this is according to Foreign Minister Molotov in the book Molotov Remembers, eventually testing the first Soviet atomic bomb by explosion on August 29, 1949. So USSR, they developed the bomb by August 29. So it's 4 years after the US did, just what the scientists had thought. So now I come to the major issue of today, which is why I think is more important to talk about it than I think most everybody knows the reasons and what happened, which I described so far. So Alperovitz explained why he wrote his 1994 book, The Decision to Use Atomic Bomb. He came across the statement by J. Samuel Walker, the chief historian of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, summarizing the expert opinion on the use of the two atom bombs. Now, this is historian, he's not writing as a person, independent historian, but for US Regulatory Commission. So this is afterwards, in 1950s, he's writing. The consensus among the scholars, this is a quotation from there. The consensus among the scholars is that the bomb was not needed to avoid an invasion of Japan and to end the war in a relatively short time. It is clear that alternatives to the bomb existed, and that alternatives included bombing, a demonstration effect on the military target somewhere, and most of all, the threat of Russian invasion. It is clear that the alternative existed, end of quote. So this posed this obvious question to Alperovitz. How could it be that what leading military figures believed at that time, and now many historians had concluded, was so radically different from what majority Americans still believed? Now, this is Alperovitz' survey of Americans, right? In my 1995 article on the same subject, this is me, Raj, I posed this question, and I'm quoting from my article. The bombings led off the development of nuclear arsenals and an arms race which has terrified successive generations of the people of the world. The resources devoted to nuclear arms have consumed vast sums that could have alleviated poverty and misery of a large number of world's poor people. So on the 50th anniversary, how does a nation that unleashed such an apocalyptic terror come to terms with its own past? This is my question I posed in my article. I too had found, after arriving in the US, and I've already explained to you about how fellow engineers, etc., viewed this bombing, and I was quite shocked to hear that, because my conception was very negative. So anyway, I come to that. So this was really why Alperovitz wrote the book and why I wrote the article unaware of his book. This is from, I gathered from Takaki's book, whom I knew personally later on after I read his book. Racialization was in the Pacific theater was much higher. In fact, war in this theater was racialized, whereas the war against Nazi Germany was not racialized. I mean, Nazis considered people inferior, people of color, Jews, Eastern Europeans, blacks, and all that, but they didn't consider the English and Americans in this sense. So they were the same. They considered them civilized people. So it wasn't a racial conflict. Americans too, it was a Nazi, not the German people. They were not fighting German people. They're fighting the Nazis. But not so in the case of Japan. But it was a two-way street. The Japanese also considered, they racialized the war too. They in fact had, the history of that is this. When the US Commodore Perry in 1853 forcibly opened Japan for trade, that is the commodities trade, which American capitalism growing was creating. It ignited a dynamic changes in the feudal Japan. Japan was feudal until then, which were also related to US and European colonization of China. From both these experiences, the Japanese leaders concluded that Japan would be the next victim of colonialism. This triggered the Meiji Restoration, which strengthened the monarchy, brought about heavy industrialization under the state, and then privatization of this industry. So Japanese capitalism advanced from that Meiji Restoration. This also led to militarization and developed modern army in Japan, replacing the samurai system. They used to have a samurai system, right? But it also brought ruin to many small farmers, these law changes, and forced 380,000 of them to emigrate to the US. More than half of them settled in Hawaii, and the rest settled in Oregon and California. So this was the other yellow peril that American population saw them, that is white population. So this is how they were greeted by the American white majority in California and Oregon, which were majority white states, right? This forced the Japanese immigrants to live in ghettoized segregation and made them easy prey of racism, just as had happened to the freed slaves who moved up north to escape their former masters. So this is the background of American. I mean, the Japanese also had their own version, right? They considered themselves, the Japanese had considered themselves in their ideology, Japanese ideology of nation, considered themselves superior people belonging to the Yamato race. And they considered it was their duty as such to enlighten the inferior races. So it's the reverse of the American racism, parallel mirror image. The ideology considered Japanese as the sole superior race in the world, not just in Asia. American Europeans were termed brutes and monsters. Now that's partly because of what they did to Japanese to pry open for trade and what they did to China. So they had a slogan called "Beat bestial Americans to death," in Japan in this war. And this whole thing led to the Japanese soldiers to commit atrocities on US POWs, as in the Bataan Death March in Philippines, and Japanese slaughter of over 100,000 Chinese, well known in rape of Nanking. So Japanese were very racist. There's no question, but in America, this racism also existed, white racism against people of color. And Japanese were the victim. Japanese immigrants were the victims. Now, there was a law against the Chinese becoming citizens before that, okay? But there was no law against Japanese. So some of the Japanese became citizens, but then the citizenship was taken away from them. And the question was why? And when matter went all the way to the Supreme Court and was ruled, yes, no, they can't be citizens. So, so there is this, and then there was the Asian Exclusion Act in 1924, which denied property ownership to all people of Asia. That was also for Indian nations who came as indentured labor in Hawaii and California. Okay, so this is what was going on. So the war, therefore, with Japan became kind of a racist fight. Okay, this is according to Takaki. Whereas wasn't so with, so it was easier to use nuclear bomb. It was easy to explain it to the American people. And in America, the Japanese were called dirty Japs, okay? So this is the character difference, but this was not the reason why the bomb was dropped. The bomb was dropped for the reasons that I mentioned, that is power equation between Russia and America. Now, as you know, there were internment camps where the Japanese were sent in during the Second World War. And this came out from the Thomas Jefferson's Jeffersonian American idea of a country called the US, that it was a white race country. You know, after all, it was by conquest over the non-white Indian tribal nations that the European built settler colonial country, United States. Japanese immigrants were thought by this racist thinking to be incapable of changing loyalty even after becoming US citizens. Now that's the public perception, right? But that is not at the level of the administration. J. Edgar Hoover was FBI director even then, right? In his report to the Attorney General, to whom he wrote the report in February 1942, he had concluded that the proposed mass internment of the Japanese could not be justified for security reasons. But what happened? LA Times, Time Magazine, Veterans Organization, California and Oregon began a drumbeat for evacuating, quote unquote, evacuating, that is uprooting the Japanese Americans from their states where they, in their opinion, pose a risk as potential enemy agents. Anyway, the Attorney General of the United States at that time, Francis Biddle, had advised Roosevelt in February 42, that there was no reasons for mass evacuations of these Japanese Americans. But Roosevelt went ahead and signed the order based on the advice of General John L. DeWitt, Army commander, US Army commander, who said, well, these Japanese cannot be trusted on the West Coast because they may become enemy agents. So if you were to look at Roosevelt and Truman, our general impression is Roosevelt was a good guy, Truman not so good. But it was Roosevelt, not Truman, who was the one to intern the Japanese Americans. And in fact, Trump opposed it. So 120,000 Japanese were interned in what I can only be described as concentration camps, although they were called internment camps. Despite his racist views, of course, they were not killed, unlike Germans. So they're not comparable to German concentration camps. I'm not comparing that. But truly speaking, they were concentration camps. Despite his racist views of blacks, and he was a racist, you know, Truman as vice president had opposed the internment of Japanese Americans, okay? But it made it easy for him to explain to the Americans the atomic bombing of Japan. So that's what it plays a role, not in the decision. Now, I think just as a side thing, I want to mention that the highest decorated US military unit in the Second World War was the 442nd Infantry Regiment, which was manned almost exclusively by the immigrant Japanese Americans, which are by the Japanese called Nisei, if I pronounce that right. Of the 14,000 Nisei soldiers who served in this regiment, nearly 2/3 suffered casualties, including 600 dead. They had to prove their loyalty. And in fact, that was their main thing, because they didn't want their interned families to suffer more. They wanted to prove that the Japanese are loyal to America. I mean, this is what they put them up to. Anyway, I'm going to return to this atomic issue of bombing. And I'm going to talk now a little bit about atomic monopoly and monopoly capitalism. And I'm coming closer, yes, I will come closer to the end, but not quite yet. So wiser minds in the US in military, atomic scientists, and government leadership knew the atomic monopoly could not be retained for long, and that letting out the genie of its destructive power was dangerous and destabilizing for the entire world. Mehmet, should I try to put on my camera on and see if it works?
If you have anything to share on the screen, yeah, let's try it if you like.
I don't, but...
Oh, then let's continue like this. Let's not jeopardize it.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay. But those, you know, so there were scientists and even in government leadership, including Secretary Stimson and many others, as you know, they knew and they believed monopoly in nuclear arms could not be retained for long. And that letting out the genie of his destructive power was dangerous and destabilizing for the entire world. But those others in power, representing monopoly capitalist mindset of dominating others, in order to serve its insatiable drive for profits, this is my opinion, an accumulation of capital could not resist the temptation of monopoly of military power. So, as historian Alperovitz argued in his 1995 book, the decision to use the atomic bomb, and historian Takaki in his book, Hiroshima, Why America Dropped the Atomic Bomb, both concurred. The overarching reason was the power equation between the US and the USSR. The US announces its accession to the throne of imperialism, and this was a loud warning to the Russians. It no longer needed the Soviets to help end the war with Japan, and it made sure Japan would remain its sphere of influence, and indeed it has as a subservient client state. So a little bit about atomic arms race and policy. Now, socialism, the first stage of communism, was ascendant since 1917 Russian Revolution. The monopoly on atomic weapons was broken, and an arms race ensued, as we all know. The USSR adopted the no first use policy, but the US did not, and has maintained its first strike policy to this day. Okay, very appropriate for an imperialist capitalist nation. Socialism rolled back. Now, in order not to become a victim, the USSR had to divert a lot of its resources on defense, atomic bombs and missiles and conventional forces, and this led to dissatisfaction in the public after some time. This is one of the factors that have contributed to accommodation with capitalism. I'm not saying this is the major reason, but it's one of the factors. And that in turn to the formal dismantling of socialism in the USSR and what I believe is informal dismantling of it in China. Atomic radiation casualties also continued. So I want to mention that in an article published in Washington Post on 6 August this past week, Rick Nowak, reported on deaths caused by atomic testing since first test in Nevada that killed one of the scientists, as I mentioned, exposed accidentally to radiation. He says, Nowak says, the effect, I'm quoting, the effect of testing have often manifested in an increase in cancer rates. Estimates of the number of people who have died as a result of atmospheric tests conducted by the United States from 1940s through 60s range from more than 10,000 to an order of magnitude beyond that. That means 100,000. Many more have died, as you know, in accidents in nuclear power elsewhere. So, and testing also. Now I come to public perception. So how has Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombing looked at by US mass media and the US public? From 85% approval in 1945, public support for these barbaric acts had reduced to 56% by 1995. That's when I wrote my article. But a survey I conducted in the US media in 95 on the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I also found that almost all of the writers in the major news media were, in television included, and this included Boston Globe, I think it includes New York Times, LA Times, Time magazines, and others, publications which shaped the public opinion, still argued, as had Truman, that it was needed to end the war and it saved lives, not just the US lives, but also Japanese lives. So you can see what mass media is doing, despite the fact the President Eisenhower himself had said no, and it came out after he came out retired and very strongly spoke on that. Okay, now, but there is a reduction. So this is the next item, reduction of the support for atomic bombing. So how does the US public see Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombing today? I'll finish very quickly now. It is now around 44% of the population. But the latest thing is that I surveyed literature, at least so far, and some of it will come out slowly, except for publication like RT, which is of course Russian, and of Consortium News, where the historian of the left has written article. Basically, all the American major news media, that includes foreign affairs, are basically now not talking about justification, but about whether it was a crime, war crime or not. And they say, well, it's debatable. And they're talking about how Japanese people and American people accommodated to each other, now how they became nicey nice and that kind of stuff. So now last point is that 2 points is Obama was the first sitting US president who went to Hiroshima in 2016, but he did not apologize for war crimes. For the war crime that the atomic bombing definitely was, and is still being denied in the US media. He was not free to do that. So instead, he just hugged the survivors and wished for a nuclear-free war, you know, whatever you expect from a liberal. Now, Trump, on the other hand, is going more nuclear. Trump is not a touchy-feely man, as you know. He started the process of revamping the nuclear arsenal of the US at the estimated cost of $1.2 trillion, which will surely double, if not quadruple, if past is any guide on such matters. The US has been dropping treaties negotiated with the Soviets on nuclear arsenals one by one, those that have kept the world from nuclear war. Putin has offered to negotiate, even share his technology that he has developed, that on which he's ahead of the US. But the liberals, by demonizing Putin and Russia, have made it impossible for any US present or foreseeable future president to compromise on it. The nuclear clock of the atomic scientists is just 100 seconds from the high noon of nuclear annihilation of our world today. And with that, I thank you for listening and being patient to me and all the screw-ups that happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. You may want to unmute yourself, yes? Or you can't. Just a minute. Try it now, Gene.
Maybe everybody could be unmuted and see how it goes. And if it doesn't work, we can mute.
Yeah, let's. You're okay, Gene?
Otherwise, it takes time for people to do all this.
Yeah, let me.
Am I here yet?
Yes, you are.
Yes,
yes, you are.
We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Raj. That was a very interesting and good discussion of the atomic bombing and material about that. Let me just say, first of all, that I put the information about making donations to our institute in the chat. And I don't know if Richard wants to say anything about that, or Richard Fallenbaum, our treasurer.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, we still need donations. I urge people, even though we're not meeting at the library, we still have obligations to the library, and we want to meet them. Plus, we have some expenses ourselves. There's some plans to modernize our website, and we also need to expand our email facilities, and all that costs money. Even the Zoom meeting, which is we're using slightly more of the facilities than would be in a free. So so that's a cost too. So I'd really strongly urge people who haven't donated before to send some money to the, either through PayPal or a check or even cash. Or if there's some other means they would like to try, please contact me and we'll try and arrange it. Thank you very much for your donation.
Okay, and I'll just remind people, first of all, that all this information is on our webpage, icssmarks.org. So check our webpage for information on upcoming programs as well. And I think that's all I have. Alan, you already announced next week's performance program. So back to you.
Okay, so we're going to open up for discussion here. And the way we do this is that if everybody could take a look at the participants list, you can get to that by clicking on the icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And for those of you who are on video, you can raise your hand by clicking on raise hand. And those who are dialing in by telephone with audio only can do *9 to raise your hand. And we will call people in order. We'll give priority to people who have not spoken. And why don't we go ahead and get started? Let's start with, let's see. Let's start with 0138. If you want to go ahead and speak.
On the phone. On the phone.
Right. Yeah.
Am I unmuted?
Yes,
this
you
is
are.
Salazar.
Oh,
Lazar.
Hi.
Salazar talking. All right, first of all, I'd like to thank Raj for that excellent coverage, and that I got to learn some new details about the threat to the Soviet Union that Eisenhower purportedly was behind. But I would like to mention, maybe I have got it wrong, but Eisenhower did not meet Stimson at Potsdam. He came back and talked to him in the United States and tried to dissuade him from using the A-bomb, this hideous civilian weapon. Most of the military, even MacArthur, but unfortunately MacArthur considered Korean communists subhuman, but he said, I'm a military man, this is a civilian weapon, and he opposed its use in Hiroshima. So here, even the right-wing military opposed it. There was absolutely no reason whatsoever. U.S. intel, and so Truman did know that intel and all top military opposed it. As Raj said, Curtis LeMay even told him. So it was a criminal act, a crime against humanity. We should also add that the firebombing of Tokyo itself was a crime against the phosphorus firebombing, where a little baby would get it, they think it was out, and then all of a sudden it would burst again into the bones. It was the most hideous thing. And Raj also mentioned Dresden, but he could have also mentioned Hamburg, where they specifically targeted Altona and the working class districts. They did not touch Blankenese, the wealthy district of Hamburg. These were purposeful terror bombings, supposedly to get the working class to oppose the military. I would like to, though it wasn't touched upon, often in Cold War history, they say that Werner Heisenberg was trying to sabotage the atomic bomb program. Complete bull. The excellent biography by Cassidy refutes the Powers Cold War biography about Heisenberg. It's called Uncertainty. Heisenberg was pro-Nazi. He was not a member of Nazis. He had shot workers who formed the Soviet in Germany when a student, and after the students went out to help the right wing kill these workers, he would go up on the rooftop and contemplate cosmology. So a lot of our history is totally distorted. And the book, the second book by Alperovich is called The Decision to Drop the Bomb, I believe. That's how I have both books, and they're very excellent. And Raj did a very nice job summing it up. As far as the spy ring, it was mainly the British spy ring that helped the Soviet Union. The one in the United States, I think the defense should have been, we are helping our ally, and they should have fought it in that way. It was, the case against the Rosenbergs was fraudulent from beginning to end. The prosecution and the judge vacationed together before the trial and had illegal ex parte conversation during the trial. They did help the Soviet Union. They should have fought it on that basis, but unfortunately didn't. And they even sequestered this stupid supposed drawing of the atomic bomb lens that Greenblatt did, which was totally ridiculous. And any scientist could have refuted it. And unfortunately, Manny Block went along with this and had it sequestered. So there's so many aspects to this case and to this criminal act by the United States, imperialism. Thank you very much.
Okay, next speaker is
Just may
Larry
I
and then
comment
Marilyn.
on that just very briefly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
go ahead,
I
Raj.
agree with most everything Lazar said. The only thing I would say, I mean, I don't know about the spy ring thing. I think how it happened, I don't know. But they were basically providing information to, I call it Soviet spy ring. Maybe they were English communists who were active in it. But two things I want to mention. One is that Stalin was asked to participate in the Dresden bombing, and he declined, saying that the Soviets don't believe in targeting civilians as enemies. And I forget the other details, so let go of that. That's all.
Okay, so our next question will be Larry, followed by Marilyn, and I'm going to be timing these about 2 minutes for each questioner. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I appreciate Raj's presentation, but there's one thing that I have that he didn't have, and that is, according to the Los Angeles Times on August 5th, 2005, McGeorge Bundy, the man who popularized the figure that 1 million lives were saved by the bombs, later confessed that he had pulled the number out of the air to justify the bombings. Second point is, Raj mentioned somebody who had killed with radiation. Well, Madame Curie, who got the Nobel Prize for that, also died from radiation. And the third thing I wanted to mention was that Trump may be spending a lot of money on nuclear, but the foreign policy of Trump and the Koch brothers that back him up are not interested in foreign wars. They're trying to get out of these countries, Syria and Germany and so on. And I think what they're trying to do is just make a lot of money off the investments, but not that they're going to use them. Although, of course, if they're there, anybody can use them, and any president and so on. That's it.
I don't know if that's correct.
Okay, I don't need to comment on this, so that's fine. That's informational. Thanks, Larry.
Alan, unmute yourself.
Wasn't I going to be next?
Marilyn, you're next,
After
followed
Alan?
by Jean.
Okay.
Okay. Marilyn?
Okay, I thought Alan was. Yeah, thank you very much, Raj. Excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. In terms of the what the scientists were told in Los Alamos, I found that passage in Gara Perovitz's book. It was May 28th, 1945. Burns told them he was much concerned about the spreading of Russian influence in Europe. And as you said, his view was that our possessing and demonstrating the bomb would make Russia more manageable in Europe, really chilling. And at that meeting, this meeting was in South Carolina, were Leo Szilard, Walter Bartke, and Harold C. Urey. I'm wondering what those top scientists told the others working on the Manhattan Project. And the reason I ask is my uncle, the husband of my mother's sister, was a physicist who was part of the team in Los Alamos working on the bomb. He was a fairly low-level scientist. He wasn't one of the top people, but he was there. And before he passed away, about 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago or so. I had a chance, it always troubled me knowing about that. I had a chance to have a conversation, and I asked him, how did you feel about working on this? And what he told me, he was already pretty elderly. He said, well, we were convinced that if we didn't develop the bomb, the Germans would do it. So I know that theory has been debunked, but I'm wondering, do you think it's possible that the top scientist told the other people on the team, gave them that explanation to make sure all the other people on the team stayed engaged?
Okay, Marilyn, thanks. Yes, I do not have any information to say that. My impression is that the scientists believe what Germans will develop, and they have the capacity. I mean, they had the most advanced physics at that time in the mid-30s. And but I don't know if the U.S. intelligence knew that the plans were dropped, and that's possible. But I have not read anywhere to confirm or deny it. I believe that once you have the possession of such a devastating power, the temptation on part of governments in general would be to develop it for either their protection or use it. The Americans hadn't used it. They weren't aware that they already knew and working on it 2 years ahead. So his 6 years was right, but it was only in 4 years. And for people like Burns and basically representative of a great rising imperialist power, that didn't matter. I mean, people's lives don't matter. And that's where the distinction between Soviet policy, that they will not be the first one to use, they'll respond with it, but it will not be the first one used. By the way, China has, I believe, the same policy. India has the same policy. Well, India is not significant in that, but they have that policy. But the major powers are Russia and US in nuclear, arms and delivery systems, and still Soviet power has now he has changed it. Putin has changed it because Russia is threatened by American forces in Europe, where they have gotten away from intermediate range missile treaty, etc. So Putin said they will use tactical nuclear weapons if they need to. So that change came as a result of this thing. But earlier, Soviet Union had this policy, and they had an agreement on short and medium-range weapons, which policy treaties have been allowed to lapse, and not by Americans. I mean, Putin kept asking for it. So that's where it is, in my opinion. Thank you for your comments.
Next up is Jean, followed by Roger, and then Philomena.
Alan, do you want me to time it, or?
I'm timing.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you very much. All the comments, I really appreciate the discussion we've had. I just want to remind people that last year at this time, I did give a talk on the topic titled Lies and the Lying Liars That Build Nuclear Weapons, because the people that are building nuclear weapons have lied since before step one in exploding the nuclear weapon. And they've continued along those lines to the present day. Everything they're saying basically has to be looked at as a lie. Now, immediately after World War II ended, the United Nations was formed, and the very first item on the agenda of the United Nations was nuclear weapons. And item one, they formed the Nuclear Energy Commission, and the purpose of that was to take the control of the nuclear weapons out of the hands of the United States and form an international body which would control that. And the United States used its powers in the Barrach report, basically to set up something that they knew the Soviet Union could not accept. Namely, it would give the United States the power to invade any country. that used nuclear weapons. So that goes back to the beginnings of the Cold War. That has all been a lie. And most people, and unfortunately, most people in the United States now believe that those weapons are being used to defend us from the Soviet Union. And that is a total fabrication. And bringing it up to the present day, there's massive China bashing. There used to be Soviet bashing. We all knew about that, the anti-communist hysteria, the McCarthy period, and so forth. And now there is China bashing. And as we speak, US warships are sailing into the South China Sea. And again, this brings the threat of nuclear war ever more present. And I think we need to be aware of that. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, next up is Roger.
Well, thank you, Raj, for your presentation. I'd like to segue off of Alazar's very scholarly and excellent comments about the first salvo of the Cold War, which was Truman's dropping of the bomb. And this was a bomb that was dropped by Democrats. And the theme I would have in my comments is that the Democrats have not gotten the credit that they deserve in fomenting and continuing the Cold War. As Alazar pointed out, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and most of the Republicans, including Curtis LeMay, were opposed to the dropping of the bombs in Japan. But the first salvo of the Cold War was made by a Democrat. And the first Red Scare in the post-war period came in 1947 with Truman's executive order establishing loyalty oaths. It wasn't until 1950, a few years later, that McCarthy even became nationally known. He was completely unknown until 1950. So it was Truman who started the Cold War and actually both home and abroad and persecuted it. I just looked up in Wikipedia, Cold War, and they have a long presentation on Cold War, but they don't even mention McCarthy. They mentioned Truman throughout. So Truman dropped the bomb. He started the executive order loyalty oaths of 1947. He also established what they called the Truman Doctrine, which is the Cold War doctrine of the United States establishing, and he established the CIA. He unified the Department of Defense, and he developed the National Security Council. Fast forward, and he also started the U.S. involvement in Korea with the U.S. involvement in the Korean War, which is a proxy war of the Cold War. We can get to the, did I get 15 seconds more?
Go ahead, finish up, Roger.
Thank you. Then we have John Kennedy, who was the one who, his Harvard think tank established that you could win a nuclear war. Up until then, it was thought that a nuclear war would be mad, mutual assured deterrent. But his think tank convinced them that you could have a nuclear war. He brought the world very close to nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he also was the one who escalated the Vietnam War. Secondly, when he left office, not voluntarily, of course, the LBJ was the one who further escalated the Vietnam War. And then finally, we should mention that, well, Trump has pushed the modernization of nuclear weapons, as others have commented in the chat. It was Obama who actually began the multi-trillion-dollar modernization of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I comment?
Roger, did you have a comment? Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
Can I comment? Yeah, I think Roger, I agree with Roger that we should not view the Democrats as the softer, nicer people who would not start a war and things. So it's very, very appropriate to point that out, because that's where people think they have misgivings. But in fact, I also have some disagreement with the view with Larry and analysis that somehow Trump and the wing of capitalists they want to do entirely domestic. I mean, basically, the capitalists, both parties represent capitalism. Yes, there are two wings, but capitalism in its stage of monopoly capital requires this dominance. And I don't think they're all that different. So I don't think we should be any illusion that either party is not a nuclear, I mean, they will go to the extent if they knew they will not be harmed themselves, they'll use nuclear weapons. Both parties are capable of it. And I mean, Trump said we should have kept the oil in Iraq and things like that. So I think this distinction, just beating up on Democrats, is unnecessary because both of them are equally. But that's correct. I mean, not to the extent people carry the impression that somehow the Democrats would be better is not correct. And that I totally agree with both Larry and Roger.
Okay, Philomena, if you would unmute and ask your question. It's on the lower left. There you go.
Is that right? Can you hear me?
That's good. That's good.
Now I'm
Thank
going.
you.
I'm a little bit all over the place. However, I'm going to start with Marilyn. Like her, I was involved as a child in World War II. My father was in Singapore during the Japanese occupation. And I was born in India because my mother was expecting me. We went on one of the last ships out of Singapore with families trying to escape. So we really didn't see my father till I was 7. And he told us a lot about the Japanese occupation. The Japanese were not kind. It was a terrible occupation, terror and just absolute taking people to concentration camps without warning and eventually starvation. And so I'm going to give you his version of this bombing. I mean, he always said that war makes people animals. He never wanted to be in another war. He was not against Japanese people who were there as troops and everything. He said it was the war that made them cruel and authoritarian, and they just simply terrorized the population. And but what he said was, toward the end of the war, the Japanese were simply not willing to surrender. To me, what I see from reading history now is that in Germany, there was even opposition, even among their generals and their army, against Hitler. And that is what led to the end of the war. They were trying to get rid of Hitler, but that didn't go on in Japan. The generals there and the emperor, everybody, according to my father, and I don't know what has been written about this, and from the Japanese end point of what went on in Japan during that ending period, they would not surrender. And my father said if they had not bombed and made the Japanese generals and emperor surrender, they had but 1 or 2 weeks left. They were on the edge of starvation in Singapore. And of course, the bombs and all that. So there's a kind of a mixed feeling about this, that of course it's wrong to throw an atomic bomb, but I can't agree that it's all entirely something racial. You know, they didn't do it to Germany, but they did it to Japan. I'm Indian, and I'm not going to say that Indians are not racist and Japanese are not racist, and Japanese are very racist. I lived with them post-war myself. And what I'm going to say is that all people are racist. Americans, white Americans are racist, but there are also African Americans who are reverse racist. So we can't just say one group of people is racist and another isn't. I think that this was about war, and the Japanese wouldn't surrender. And so I want
that's about 2 minutes now. If you mean,
yes.
Go ahead.
And I only want to say that in the end, the foreign aid went to Japan and established capitalism in Japan very well. And I wanted to know what you have to say about that.
Okay, so may I respond?
Yes.
Thank you, Philomena, who I see otherwise in different circumstance in music. Anyway, thanks for coming to today's session and contributing. You might benefit from reading Karl Alperovitz's 1995 book. And I have an electronic version of it, and I don't know how to share it. If I knew how to, I will share it with you. But I just paid $10 for it. He shows, of course, I mentioned both the racism was both sides, okay? And I showed the character racism. And but I also said that wasn't a factor in deciding the bomb, okay? And nor does Professor Takaki suggest in his book. So it was just to describe, and I said it made it easier to explain to American people this otherwise a brutal act, a barbaric act. Now, the idea that the Japanese would never have surrendered because they believed in Emperor. Actually, Emperor, 3 months before, Emperor was even willing to say in the end, this is well before the bomb was dropped, and they approached Russians, they tried to approach Americans. He was saying, look, even if they kill me, I cannot stand this happening to our country. Okay, this Hirohito said. And the other thing was, if Hirohito said stop the war, the Japanese would follow. Yes, they actually believed in their emperor. They were very loyal to him. So the issue here is not who's more racist. The racism wasn't the reason why the bomb was used. The bomb was used by Americans to project their, announce their power and to contain Soviet Union influence in Asia and in Europe. I mean, this is what Alperovitz's entire book documents very well, particularly the 1995 book. I would suggest you read that. And so as far as Japan becoming a prosperous and wealthy country, I personally think that both capitalism, both in China, I'm opposed to development of capitalism anywhere, and Japan and China included, because it dehumanizes working people, makes them powerless, and we can build a society which is more equitable, where human needs are met, and we don't have a consumer ecologically destructive commodity production. So that's my answer. I cannot go along with capitalism as something good. It is very harmful. It develops productive capacity very fast. That is true, but at entire human cost. And today we are facing really a terminal problem, both from the nuclear weapons and ecological destruction of the planet, or debasement of the planet, if not destruction. So on that, I have to respectfully disagree with you, but I recommend you read Alperovitz's book to get little understanding of what was going on 3-4 months before the bombs were dropped, what is the reality and what is being projected to American people. Your father, of course, his personal experiences, I cannot say he experienced very bad things with Japanese, and nobody's denying. And so therefore, it is not for the praise of Japanese militarism that I was saying the nuclear weapons should not have been used. It is that it were unnecessary and was done for a different purpose. Thank you.
Okay, next up is caller 9307 from telephone, and then Maryland. And others who haven't spoken, please raise your hand and ask your question. So 9307, if you would unmute and go ahead. Let's see. I think they may have, oh, okay.
9307 is me, I already spoke.
Oh, okay. Okay, you're on twice. Okay, Marilyn, if you want to go ahead and speak, and then others who want to chime in, please raise your hand.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me ask another question. This has to do with US attitudes about the Soviet Union. Clearly during the war, they were our allies. Officially, they were our allies, even though some generals may have known in the, behind the scenes that we didn't really want to have to work with them in perpetuity. And so I'm wondering, the switch seems to have happened with Truman. Truman listened to his advisors who told him to take a harder line on the Soviet Union. But I'm wondering, do any of you know what the PR and propaganda mechanism was to get the switch, the American people to switch their thinking? For example, as late as 1944, my son-in-law is a film studies person. As late as 1944, there was a film which I watched, he recommended it, made in Hollywood that starred Gregory Peck as Vladimir, the heroic Russian resistance fighter fighting against the evil Nazis. So the US was using propaganda to build up the Russians as our allies, again, and of course demonize the Germans. So at what point in 1945 or 1946 did the propaganda machine kick into gear to get the US people to see the Soviets as our evil enemies? And what did that look like, if any of you know? Thank you.
May I answer that question, at least partially? Okay, Marilyn, that's a very good question. Actually, the Americans were unlike the British. British were always imperialist. The Americans were kind of new on the scene. I mean, they were not yet preeminent imperialist power. They were not the masters of the universe. They had somewhat open view, although they were also, as I pointed out, in 1917-21, the Civil War period in Soviet Union, they were assisting. And they, in fact, occupied Vladivostok. So they were opposed to them. But when Hitler began his war, they realized that, and they all wanted him to go and destroy Soviet Union. And that's why this whole diplomacy in the British Prime Minister Chamberlain went there, more or less said peace in our time, basically is trying to direct Hitler east. And of course, the Soviets knew that what they're doing, because they had tried to get them to become allies with both France and England, basically sat on and never did anything about it. So it was a clear sign for Hitler to go destroy them. But then Hitler became a problem for them too. It was clear that Hitler was not going to just stop. He's going to use the Soviet Unions, if they were to defeat him, as a base for the rest of the conquest of the colonies. And then Hitler really hated UK, Britain. Not because of any nice reason, but because he didn't like them to own half the world, and Germany be kept out of being colonial power. So, so Americans actually under Roosevelt died in April of 45, knew that Soviet Union was essential to defeat of Hitler. And so, of course, he dies, and we can't predict what would have happened. But in 45, with Truman, what happened was that the question was of Poland. I mean, Soviet Union Stalin argued that we can't allow an unfriendly power to come, regime to come in Poland, because all the invasions of Russia have happened through Poland, including Second World War. It was crucial. So, and this was the thing, and there was a anti-communist faction, and Soviet Union helped install a pro-Soviet faction there, although Stalin was willing to have neutrality. So for this reason, that was the firing shot of the Cold War. But Churchill even wanted to use the defeated German army to go and attack Soviet Union right after the war. Of course, Roosevelt didn't go along. And then Truman wouldn't go along with such a harebrained scheme. But this is a conflict between the two sets of ideologies, capitalist and socialist. There is no room, only one would survive. And so there is a life and death struggle between them. It was going to come out sooner or later. And it started in 1946 with Poland as the issue, but it would have come about regardless, even if Soviet Union did not get influence in Eastern Europe for their own defense and influence, it would have come up, I think. So I think that's the start, to my knowledge, Marilyn. Maybe others know more. Yeah.
Next up is 0138, caller, telephone number 0138.
That's Elazar, I think.
Is that Elazar? Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is Elazar. Anytime someone who hasn't spoken comes in, you can set me aside.
Go right ahead, Elazar. You're on.
I'll try to be brief. Number one, I think Raj stated that the Americans were fighting the Nazis. I think that's incorrect. The only anti-Nazi, anti-fascist main force was the Soviet Union. The United States fought an inter-imperialist war with Japan and Germany. The United States ruling class, all the monopoly capitalist firms, all the way through the war, including after the declaration of war, traded with the Nazis. United States policy was coordinated with British and French policy to use the combat capitalist state of Nazism with a totally, what's the right word, atomized working class of Germany, no unions left, totally under the monitoring of the Nazis, to attack the combat worker state of the Soviet Union, because they knew that they failed with their parliamentary baggage when they tried to destroy it right after the revolution, when Churchill organized as many as 21 countries to attack the Soviet Union. United States imperialism's goal all the way through the war was to bleed the Soviet Union by the Nazi attack. All the way through. There was talk about allies, but Roosevelt never prosecuted a single one of the big corporations like Standard of Jersey, GM, Kodak, Sinclair, Ford. Ford's plant was bombed by Allied bombers. In Nazi-occupied Germany, making things for the war. He sued an American court and won damages. Okay, so it was not an anti-Nazi war. It was a racist war. You could say, no, it was an inter-imperialist war. We used racist metaphors. There were Germans also interned in the United States, German-American citizens. Now, in terms of Japan.
There are three others on the line to wrap up.
My time up already?
Go ahead.
Time up? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead and finish up real quickly.
Let me finish my sentence. That in terms of Japan, Eisenhower already told Stimson that Japan was trying to contact Sweden so they could get out of the war and surrender. I'm through. Thank you.
Okay. I just want to say quickly that Elazar is misunderstanding.
Were you telling me my time was up? I couldn't tell what you were saying.
No, but I'm
okay.
saying that you misunderstood, therefore misquoted me.
What are you saying? I can't hear you.
I don't know, but what I can do about it, I can turn off my video. But what I'm saying is that I do not think that you understood what I said or didn't, and therefore misquoted me. I didn't say that Americans were fighting Nazis. I mean, Americans accepted when Hitler became a menace for the Western capitalism is when they joined and therefore they supported Soviet Union in the war. That is the difference between what I said and what you interpreted.
Am I still unmuted?
All right, call on the other people
hold
now.
On. Yeah, okay. Let's actually we can open this up in a moment. Let's go ahead with Richard hasn't spoken yet, followed by Anne, who hasn't spoken yet. And then we'll open it up later. Richard?
Yeah, just one side issue, or maybe not a side issue, I read recently from a Russian writer, And he pointed out the importance of the Bretton Woods Conference, which was in '44, when they were planning the post-war financial world, and there was a Soviet delegation participated, and all the countries had to sign on to basically accept US domination, financial domination in the post-war world, and the Soviets refused. They did not sign on. They did not accept the dollar as the hegemonic financial power. So that was one other factor that cemented in the hostility of US imperialism to Soviet Union. It was not until the Khrushchev regime came to power that they began to soften their hostility. And of course, they became big supporters of Russia when Gorbachev and then Yeltsin came to power. That's all.
Okay, next is Anne, and then we're at 12:30. We're going to wrap it up pretty quickly. So Anne, if you would go ahead and unmute.
Sure. I think this may be a whole new topic of conversation, unfortunately, but I really want to thank Raj, and particularly because we're not just getting what the ruling class is thinking. We're also getting something about what ordinary Americans are thinking. Why are they doing things? What do they think is going on? And that kind of led me to begin thinking about, well, what's going on with the peace movement? And in the course of these many wars, we've been at war since I was born, in some fashion or other. I've seen it wax and wane, and always in this kind of difficult disconnect from the justice movement. And I just wanted to know if Raj had any comment on that question of, is there the possibility of a new resurgence of anti-war movement, anti-imperialist movement connected to the social movement around justice?
Well, I don't know more than others in this group, but my observation is that this recent anti-police brutality movement represents essentially all of that encompassed. I pointed out that by 95, less than half, 44% people still approve of Hiroshima bombing as a necessary thing, kind of like, it ended the war, saved lives. But despite heavy propaganda all through these years, now it's a minority. And if you combine that with the fact that one brutal killing, which of course has been happening all along this time, there's a tremendous reaction of popular reaction. That shows the decayed state of both capitalist system in the United States, but also that the propaganda systems are being ineffective. So out of this thing, basically, it's a struggle for social justice, and peace, world peace is part of that. So I see this as really a harbinger of something very positive if it continues and develops, which I think is going to. But that's all I can say about it. I don't know any more than what everybody else here knows about it, so I'm not an expert on this. But that's my observation.
Okay, next up is Norman, and I think we're past 12:30, so might be the last person. Norman, if you would unmute.
For crying out loud, I can't. Somebody, we need to mention Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R. We need to mention Bayer. We need to, you know what I'm talking about, the German producer of the gases used to murder Jews. The corporation that was supported by the United States, right?
Now they own Monsanto.
Yeah, there you go. Figures. Another comment about that is that the Allied forces did not bomb the railroad tracks to the concentration camps. That's my song. I sing it all the time. My husband told it to me. Another thing is I've posted a note on the chat if anybody wants to read about I'm campaigning for school board again.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, there is somebody at 9307. I don't need to comment on that, but then there is two people, him, that 9307 and Eugene, right?
Right. Let's go with 9307 and then Gene, and then I think that might be it. Is that okay?
Yeah, 9307 is me. I already spoke.
Larry.
No,
Okay.
9307 is me, David Campbell. Can
Oh, I'm
you
sorry.
hear me okay?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you, Raj.
Yeah.
Very good presentation, Raj. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've heard many of the names that we commonly associate with Hiroshima and Hiroshima. We've heard the scientists, Oppenheimer and Teller and Fermi and Heisenberg, and some of the military figures, Groves and LeMay. And we were reminded of George McBundy. The pilot was Paul Tibbets. Are there names? There's a phrase I've always liked, and that is, if you can see their faces and name their names, it's probably not them. So who were the folks behind the scenes that we don't know about, that didn't get named, but really might have played an outsized role in driving the research and ultimately the usage of the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Can you comment on that, Raj, or anyone with knowledge?
I don't know anything specifically more than what I mentioned, which is these people who actually escaped fascism from Germany, the scientists, came to the Western world and knew about development of this science and were afraid these weapons will be developed and used. And that at least three names I know, which is I mentioned in the talk. But I don't know if they were, I mean, in terms of politics, Burns stands out as the secretary who became Secretary of State, but he was of that committee, that was interim committee that was deciding about the nuclear weapon that were being developed. He turns out to be the force, but basically it's on behalf. I generally would say that instead of people, basically my thing is unnecessary to actually too much focus on people, because I think the systemic need of present emerging imperialist power versus that of a worker state, Soviet Union, who will actually end up influencing the world and its events, because only one will survive. It was a life and death struggle. Both sides knew that. And in this case, capitalism survived, and we're seeing the consequences of that. Some people think it's positive, but in my opinion, it's very negative.
Okay, Gene, if you would, I think this will probably be the last one. If you want to also close out, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say on the linkage between fascism and the United States, Chomsky has a really interesting article he wrote when he was 13 at the time. I don't have it, it was on Democracy Now! But I also want to point out that there's the link. I mean, if you go back to Truman, when he was a senator, he said, I think we ought to help the Germans if the Russians are winning, and the Russians if the Germans are winning. That way they kill as many of each other off as possible. And point out further that the United States did not declare war on Nazi Germany until after Pearl Harbor, when Germany, because it was an ally of Japan, declared war on the United States because they were allies. So it wasn't until after Pearl Harbor and the Germans declared war on the United States that the United States declared war on Germany and refused to open a second front. That's a big topic. Maybe we'll make it a topic for a later talk. But I want to thank everybody for joining us. This was a very productive. Thank Raj for opening this topic, discussing his point of view, and everyone else for sharing theirs. This was very productive, and hope we continue this process. Thank you.
I'm very thankful to everybody who came and took 2 hours out of their Sunday morning and also participated, both those who agreed with me and those who don't agree with me. I appreciate both sides.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.